Section 39. Geometry. The whole science of geometry likewise rests upon the nexus of the position of the divisions of space. It would accordingly be an insight into that nexus, only such an insight being, as we have already said, impossible by means of mere conceptions, or indeed in any other way than by intuition. Every geometrical proposition would have to be brought back to sensuous intuition, and the proof would simply consist in making the particular nexus in question clear. Nothing more could be done. Nevertheless, we find geometry treated quite differently. Euclid's 12 axioms are alone held to be based upon mere intuition, and even of these only the 9th, 11th, and 12th are properly speaking admitted to be founded upon different separate intuitions, while the rest are supposed to be founded upon the knowledge that in science we do not, as in experience, deal with real things existing for themselves side by side, and susceptible of endless variety, but on the contrary with conceptions, and in mathematics with normal intuitions, i.e. figures and numbers, whose laws are binding for all experience, and which therefore combine the comprehensiveness of the conception with the complete definiteness of the single representation. For although, as intuitive representations, they are throughout determined with complete precision, no room being left in this way by anything remaining undetermined, still they are general, because they are the bare forms of all phenomena, and as such applicable to all real objects to which such forms belong. What Plato says of his ideas would therefore, even in geometry, hold good of these normal intuitions, just as well as of conceptions, i.e. that two cannot be exactly similar, for then they would be but one. This would, I say, be applicable also to normal intuitions in geometry, if it were not that, as exclusively spatial objects, these differ from one another in mere juxtaposition, that is, in place. Plato had long ago remarked this, as we are told by Aristotle in Metaphysics. Further, he asserts that in comparison with the things of the senses and with the ideas, the creations of mathematics hold the mean, insofar as they differ from things of the senses by being eternal and immovable, but from the ideas by being many and equal, whereas each of the ideas exists only as a unity. Now, the mere knowledge that such a difference of place does not annul the rest of the identity might surely, it seems to me, supersede the other 9 axioms, and would, I think, be better suited to the nature of science, whose aim is knowledge of the particular through the general, than the statement of 9 separate axioms all based upon the same insight. Moreover, what Aristotle says, "With these, equality constitutes unity," then becomes applicable to geometrical figures. But with reference to the normal intuitions in time, i.e. to numbers, even this distinction of juxtaposition no longer exists. Here, as with conceptions, absolutely nothing but the identitas indiscernibilium, identity of indiscernibles, remains, for there is but one 5 and one 7, and in this we may perhaps also find a reason why 7 plus 5 equals 12 is a synthetical proposition a priori, founded upon intuition, as Kant profoundly discovered, and not an identical one, as it is called by Herder in his Metakritik. 12 equals 12 is an identical proposition. In geometry it is therefore only in dealing with axioms that we appeal to intuition. All the other theorems are demonstrated, that is to say, a reason of knowing is given, the truth of which everyone is bound to acknowledge. The logical truth of the theorem is thus shown, but not its transcendental truth, which, as it lies in the reason of being and not in the reason of knowing, can never become evident excepting by means of intuition. This explains why this sort of geometrical demonstration, while it no doubt conveys the conviction that the theorem which has been demonstrated is true, nevertheless gives no insight as to why that which it asserts is what it is. In other words, we have not found its reason of being, but the desire to find it is usually then thoroughly roused. For proof, by indicating the reason of knowledge, only affects conviction, convictio, not knowledge, cognitio. Therefore it might perhaps be more correctly called elenchus than demonstratio. This is why in most cases, therefore, it leaves behind it that disagreeable feeling which is given by all want of insight, when perceived. And here the want of knowledge why a thing is as it is makes itself all the more keenly felt, because of the certainty just attained that it is as it is. This impression is very much like the feeling we have when something has been conjured into or out of our pocket, and we cannot conceive how. The reason of knowing, which, in such demonstrations as these, is given without the reason of being, resembles certain physical theories which present the phenomenon without being able to indicate its cause. For instance, Leidenfrost's experiment, insomuch as it succeeds also in a platina crucible, whereas the reason of being of a geometrical proposition which is discovered by intuition, like every knowledge we acquire, produces satisfaction. When once the reason of being is found, we base our conviction of the truth of the theorem upon that reason alone, and no longer upon the reason of knowing given us by the demonstration. Let us, for instance, take the 6th proposition of the first book of Euclid. If two angles of a triangle are equal, the sides also which subtend, or are opposite to, the equal angles shall be equal to one another. See the download PDF for Figure 3, which Euclid demonstrates as follows. Let ABC be a triangle having the angle ABC equal to the angle ACB, then the side AC must be equal to the side AB also. For if side AB be not equal to side AC, one of them is greater than the other. Let AB be greater than AC, and from BA cut off BD equal to CA, and draw DC. Then in the triangles DBC, ABC, because DB is equal to AC, and BC is common to both triangles. The two sides DB and BC are equal to the two sides AC, AB, each to each, and the angle DBC is equal to the angle ACB. Therefore the base DC is equal to the base AB, and the triangle DBC is equal to the triangle ABC, the less triangle equal to the greater, which is absurd. Therefore, AB is not unequal to AC, that is, AB is equal to AC. Now, in this demonstration we have a reason of knowing for the truth of the proposition. But who bases his conviction of that geometrical truth upon this proof? Do we not rather base our conviction upon the reason of being, which we know intuitively, and according to which, by a necessity which admits of no further demonstration, but only of evidence through intuition, two lines drawn from both extreme ends of another line, and inclining equally towards each other, can only meet at a point which is equally distant from both extremities, since the two arising angles are properly but one, to which the oppositeness of position gives the appearance of being two. Wherefore there is no reason why the lines should meet at any point nearer to the one end than to the other. It is the consequence of the reason of being which shows us the necessary consequence of the conditioned from its condition. In this instance, the lateral equality from the angular equality, that is, it shows their connection, whereas the reason of knowing only shows their existence. Nay, we might even maintain that the usual method of proving merely convinces us of their coexistence in the actual figure given us as an example, but by no means that they are always coexistent. For as the necessary connection is not shown, the conviction we acquire of this truth rests simply upon induction, and is based upon the fact that we find it is so in every figure we make. The reason of being is certainly not as evident in all cases as it is in simple theorems like this 6th one of Euclid. Still, I am persuaded that it might be brought to evidence in every theorem, however complicated, and that the proposition can always be reduced to some such simple intuition. Besides, we are all just as conscious a priori of the necessity of such a reason of being for each relation of space as we are of the necessity of a cause for each change. In complicated theorems it will, of course, be very difficult to show that reason of being, and this is not the place for difficult geometrical researches. Therefore, to make my meaning somewhat clearer, I will now try to bring back to its reason of being a moderately complicated proposition, in which, nevertheless, that reason is not immediately evident. Passing over the intermediate theorems, I take the 16th. In every triangle in which one side has been produced, the exterior angle is greater than either of the interior opposite angles. This Euclid demonstrates in the following manner. See the download PDF for Figure 4. Let ABC be a triangle, and let the side BC be produced to D. Then the exterior angle ACD shall be greater than either of the interior opposite angles, BAC or CBA. Bisect the side AC at E and join BE. Produce BE to F, making EF equal to EB, and join FC. Produce AC to G. Because AE is equal to EC and BE to EF, the two sides AE, EB are equal to the two sides CE, EF, each to each, and the angle AEB is equal to the angle CEF, because they are opposite vertical angles. Therefore, the base AB is equal to the base CF, and the triangle AEB is equal to the triangle CEF, and the remaining angles of one triangle to the remaining angles of the other, each to which the equal sides are opposite. Therefore, the angle BAE is equal to the angle ECF, but the angle ECD is greater than the angle ECF. Therefore, the angle ACD is greater than the angle ABC. In the same manner, if the side BC be bisected, and the side AC be produced to G, it may be demonstrated that the angle BCG, that is, the opposite vertical angle ACD, is greater than the angle ABC. My demonstration of the same proposition would be as follows. See the download PDF for Figure 5. Triangle with extended line, Figure 5. For the angle BAC to be even equal to, let alone greater than, the angle ACD, the line BA towards CA would have to lie in the same direction as BD, for this is precisely what is meant by equality of the angles, i.e., it must be parallel with BD, that is to say, BA and BD must never meet, but in order to form a triangle they must meet, reason of being, and must thus do the contrary of that which would be required for the angle BAC to be of the same size as the angle ACD. For the angle ABC to be even equal to, let alone greater than, the angle ACD, line BA must lie in the same direction towards BD as AC, for this is what is meant by equality of the angles, i.e., it must be parallel with AC, that is to say, BA and AC must never meet, but in order to form a triangle, BA and AC must meet, and must thus do the contrary of that which would be required for the angle ABC to be of the same size as ACD. By all this, I do not mean to suggest the introduction of a new method of mathematical demonstration, nor the substitution of my own proof for that of Euclid, for which its whole nature unfits it, as well as the fact that it presupposes the conception of parallel lines, which in Euclid comes much later. I merely wish to show what the reason of being is, and wherein lies the difference between it and the reason of knowing, which latter only affects convictio, a thing that differs entirely from insight into the reason of being. The fact that geometry only aims at affecting convictio, and that this, as I have said, leaves behind it a disagreeable impression, but gives no insight into the reason of being, which insight, like all knowledge, is satisfactory and pleasing, may perhaps be one of the reasons for the great dislike which many otherwise eminent heads have for mathematics. I cannot resist again giving Figure 6. See the download PDF for Figure 6, although it has already been presented elsewhere, because the mere sight of it without words conveys 10 times more persuasion of the truth of the Pythagorean theorem than Euclid's mousetrap demonstration. A square divided into 4 triangles, with 2 equal triangles added to the side. Figure 6. Those readers for whom this chapter may have a special interest will find the subject of it more fully treated in my chief work, Die Welt als Wille und Vorstellung, The World as Will and Idea, Volume 1, Section 15, Volume 2, Chapter 13. Chapter 7. On the 4th class of objects for the subject, and the form of the principle of sufficient reason which predominates in it. Section 40. General Explanation. The last class of objects for our representative faculty, which remains to be examined, is a peculiar but highly important one. It comprises but one object for each individual, that is, the immediate object of the inner sense, the subject in volition, which is object for the knowing subject, wherefore it manifests itself in time alone, never in space, and, as we shall see, even in time, under an important restriction. Section 41. Subject of knowledge and object. All knowledge presupposes subject and object, even self-consciousness, Selbstbewusstsein, therefore is not absolutely simple, but, like our consciousness of all other things, i.e. the faculty of perception, it is subdivided into that which is known and that which knows. Now, that which is known manifests itself absolutely and exclusively as will. The subject accordingly knows itself exclusively as willing, but not as knowing, for the ego which represents never can itself become representation or object, since it conditions all representations as their necessary correlate. Rather may the following beautiful passage from the sacred Upanishad be applied to it. It is not to be seen, it sees everything. It is not to be heard, it hears everything. It is not to be known, it knows everything. And it is not to be recognized, it recognizes everything. Besides, this seeing, knowing, hearing, and recognizing entity, there is no other. There can therefore be no knowledge of knowing, because this would imply separation of the subject from knowing, while it nevertheless knew that knowing, which is impossible. My answer to the objection, I not only know, but know also that I know, would be, your knowing that you know only differs in words from your knowing. I know that I know means nothing more than I know, and this again, unless it is further determined, means nothing more than ego. If your knowing and your knowing that you know are two different things, just try to separate them, and first to know without knowing that you know, then to know that you know without this knowledge being at the same time knowing. No doubt, by leaving all special knowing out of the question, we may at last arrive at the proposition, I know, the last abstraction we are able to make, but this proposition is identical with objects exist for me, and this again is identical with I am subject, in which nothing more is contained than in the bare word I. Now, it may still be asked how the various cognitive faculties belonging to the subject, such as sensibility, understanding, reason, are known to us if we do not know the subject. It is not through our knowing having become an object for us that these faculties are known to us, for then there would not be so many conflicting judgments concerning them. They are inferred rather, or more correctly, They are general expressions for the established classes of representations which, at all times, have been more or less clearly distinguished in those cognitive faculties. But with reference to the necessary correlate of these representations as their condition, i.e. the subject, these faculties are abstracted from them, the representations, and stand consequently towards the classes of representations in precisely the same relation as the subject in general towards the object in general. Now, just as the object is at once posited with the subject, for the word itself would otherwise have no meaning, and conversely, as the subject is at once posited with the object, so that being the subject means exactly as much as having an object, and being an object means the same thing as being known by the subject. So likewise, when an object is assumed as being determined in any particular way, do we also assume that the subject knows precisely in that particular way. So far, therefore, it is immaterial whether we say that objects have such and such peculiar inherent determinations, or that the subject knows in such and such ways. It is indifferent whether we say that objects are divided into such and such classes, or that such and such different cognitive faculties are peculiar to the subject. In that singular compound of depth and superficiality, Aristotle, are to be found traces even of insight into this truth, and indeed the critical philosophy lies in embryo in his works. He says, "In a certain sense the mind is all that exists," and again, "In other words, the understanding is the form of forms, and sensibility the form of sensuous objects. Accordingly, it is all one whether we say, sensibility and understanding are no more, or the world is at an end. It comes to the same thing whether we say, there are no conceptions, or reason is gone, and animals alone remain." The dispute between realism and idealism, which appeared for the last time in the dispute between the dogmatists and Kantians, or between ontology and metaphysics on the one hand, and transcendental aesthetic and transcendental logic on the other, arose out of the misapprehension of this relation, and was based upon its misapprehension with reference to the first and third classes of representations as established by me, just as the medieval dispute between realists and nominalists rested upon the misapprehension of this relation with reference to the second class. Section 42. The subject of volition. According to what has preceded, the subject of knowledge can never be known. It can never become object or representation. Nevertheless, as we have not only an outer self-knowledge in sensuous perception, but an inner one also, and as on the other hand, every knowledge by its very nature presupposes a knower and a known, what is known within us as such is not the knower but the willer, the subject of volition, the will. Starting from knowledge, we may assert that I know is an analytical I will, on the contrary, a synthetical and, moreover, an a posteriori proposition. That is, it is given by experience, in this case by inner experience, i.e. in time alone. In so far, therefore, the subject of volition would be an object for us. Introspection always shows us to ourselves as willing. In this willing, however, there are numerous degrees, from the faintest wish to passion, and I have often shown that not only all our emotions, but even all those movements of our inner man, which are subsumed under the wide conception of feeling, are states of the will. Now, the identity of the willing with the knowing subject, in virtue of which the word I includes and designates both, is the nodus of the universe, and therefore inexplicable. For we can only comprehend relations between objects, but two objects never can be one, excepting as parts of a whole. Here, where the subject is in question, the rules by which we know objects are no longer applicable, and actual identity of the knower with what is known as willing, that is, of subject and object, is immediately given. Now, whoever has clearly realized the utter impossibility of explaining this identity will surely concur with me in calling it the miracle par excellence. Just as the understanding is the subjective correlate to our first class of representations, the reason to the second, and pure sensibility to the third, so do we find that the correlate to this fourth class is the inner sense, or self-consciousness in general. Section 43. Willing. The law of motives. Motivation. It is just because the willing subject is immediately given in self-consciousness that we are unable further to define or to describe what willing is. Properly speaking, it is the most direct knowledge we have, nay, one whose immediateness must finally throw light upon every other knowledge as being very mediate. At every resolution that we take ourselves, or that we see others take, we deem ourselves justified in asking, why? That is, we assume that something must have previously occurred from which this resolution has resulted, and we call this something its reason, or more correctly, the motive of the action which now follows. Without such a reason or motive, the action is just as inconceivable for us as the movement of a lifeless body without being pushed or pulled. Motives therefore belong to causes, and have also been already numbered and characterized, among them in section 20, as the third form of causality. But all causality is only the form of the principle of sufficient reason in the first class of objects, that is, in the corporeal world given us in external perception. There it forms the link which connects changes one with another, the cause being that which, coming from outside, conditions each occurrence. The inner nature of such occurrences, on the contrary, continues to be a mystery for us, for we always remain on the outside. We certainly see this cause necessarily produce that effect, but we do not learn how it is actually enabled to do so, or what is going on inside. Thus we see mechanical, physical, chemical effects, as well as those brought about by stimuli, in each instance follow from their respective causes without, on that account, ever completely understanding the process, the essential part of which remains a mystery for us. So we attribute to it qualities of bodies, to forces of nature, or to vital energy, which, however, are all qualitatis occultae. Nor should we be at all better off as to comprehension of the movements and actions of animals and of human beings, which would also appear to us as induced in some unaccountable way by their causes, motives, were it not that here we are granted an insight into the inward part of the process. We know, that is, by our own inward experience, that this is an act of the will called forth by the motive, which consists in a mere representation. Thus the effect produced by the motive, unlike that produced by all other causes, is not only known by us from outside, in a merely indirect way, but at the same time from inside, quite directly, and therefore according to its whole mode of action. Here we stand, as it were, behind the scenes, and learn the secret of the process by which cause produces effect in its most inward nature. For here our knowledge comes to us through a totally different channel, and in a totally different way. From this results the important proposition: the action of motives, motivation, is causality seen from within. Here, accordingly, causality presents itself in quite a different way, in quite a different medium, and for quite another kind of knowledge. Therefore it must now be exhibited as a special and peculiar form of our principle, which consequently here presents itself as the principle of the sufficient reason of acting, principium rationis sufficientis agendi, or, more briefly, as the law of motives, law of motivation. As a clue to my philosophy in general, I here add that this fourth class of objects for the subject, that is, the one object contained in it, the will which we apprehend within us, stands in the same relation towards the first class as the law of motives towards the law of causality, as I have established it in section 20. This truth is the cornerstone of my whole metaphysic. As to the way in which, and the necessity with which, motives act, and as to the dependence of their action upon empirical individual character, and even upon individual capacity for knowledge, etc., etc., I refer my readers to my prize essay on the freedom of the will, in which I have treated all this more fully. Section 44. Influence of the will over the intellect. It is not upon causality proper, but upon the identity of the knowing with the willing subject, as shown in section 42, that the influence is based, which the will exercises over the intellect, when it obliges it to repeat representations that have once been present to it, and in general to turn its attention in this or that direction, and evoke at pleasure any particular series of thoughts. And even in this the will is determined by the law of motives, in accordance with which it also secretly rules what is called the association of ideas, to which I have devoted a separate chapter, the 14th, in the 2nd volume of my chief work. This association of ideas is itself nothing but the application of the principle of sufficient reason, in its 4 forms, to the subjective train of thought, that is, to the presence of representations in our consciousness. But it is the will of the individual that sets the whole mechanism in motion, by urging the intellect, in accordance with the interest, i.e. the individual aims of the person, to recall, together with its present representations, those which, either logically or analogically, or by proximity in time or space, are nearly related to them. The will's activity in this, however, is so immediate that in most cases we have no clear consciousness of it, and so rapid that we are at times even unconscious of the occasion which has thus called forth a representation. In such cases it appears as if something had come into our consciousness quite independently of all connection with anything else. That this, however, is impossible is precisely the root of the principle of sufficient reason, which has been fully explained in the above-mentioned chapter of my chief work. Every picture which suddenly presents itself to our imagination, every judgment even that does not follow its previously present reason, must be called forth by an act of volition having a motive, although that motive may often escape our perception, owing to its insignificance, and although such acts of volition are often in like manner unperceived, because they take place so easily that wish and fulfillment are simultaneous. Section 45. Memory. That peculiar faculty of the knowing subject, which enables it to obey the will the more readily in repeating representations, the oftener they have already been present to it, in other words, its capacity for being exercised, is what we call memory. I cannot agree with the customary view by which it is looked upon as a sort of storehouse in which we keep a stock of ready-made representations, always at our disposal, only without being always conscious of their possession. The voluntary repetition of representations, which have once been present, becomes so easy through practice that one link in a series of representations no sooner becomes present to us than we at once evoke all the rest, often even, as it were, involuntarily. If we were to look for a metaphor for this characteristic quality of our representative faculty, such as that of Plato, who compared it with a soft mass that receives and retains impressions, I think the best would be that of a piece of drapery, which, after having been repeatedly folded in the same folds, at last falls into them, as it were, of its own accord. The body learns by practice to obey the will, and the faculty of representing does precisely the same. A remembrance is not by any means, as the usual view supposes, always the same representation which is, as it were, fetched over and over again from its storehouse. A new one, on the contrary, arises each time. Only practice makes this especially easy. Thus it comes to pass that pictures of our imagination, which we fancy we have stowed away in our memory, become imperceptibly modified, a thing which we realize when we see some familiar object again after a long time, and find that it no longer completely corresponds to the image we bring with us. This could not be if we retained ready-made representations. It is just for this reason, too, that acquired knowledge, if left unexercised, gradually fades from our memory, precisely because it was the result of practice coming from habit and knack. Thus most scholars, for instance, forget their Greek, and most artists their Italian on their return from Italy. This is also why we find so much difficulty in recalling to mind a name or a line of poetry formerly familiar to us when we have ceased to think of it for several years, whereas when once we succeed in remembering it, we have it again at our disposal for some time, because the practice has been renewed. Everyone, therefore, who knows several languages will do well to make a point of reading occasionally in each, that he may ensure to himself their possession. This likewise explains why the surroundings and events of our childhood impress themselves so deeply on our memory. It is because in childhood we have but few, and those chiefly intuitive, representations, so that we are induced to repeat them constantly for the sake of occupation. People who have little capability for original thought do this all their lives, and, moreover, not only with intuitive representations, but with conceptions and words also. Sometimes, therefore, they have remarkably good memories, when obtuseness and sluggishness of intellect do not act as impediments. Men of genius, on the contrary, are not always endowed with the best of memories, as, for instance, Rousseau has told us of himself. Perhaps this may be accounted for by their great abundance of new thoughts and combinations, which leaves them no time for frequent repetition. Still, on the whole, genius is seldom found with a very bad memory, because here a greater energy and mobility of the whole thinking faculty makes up for the want of constant practice. Nor must we forget that Mnemosyne was the mother of the Muses. We may accordingly say that our memory stands under two contending influences, that of the energy of the representative faculty on the one hand, and that of the quantity of representations occupying that faculty on the other. The less energy there is in the faculty, the fewer must be the representations, and conversely. This explains the impaired memory of habitual novel readers, for it is with them as with men of genius. The multitude of representations following rapidly upon each other leaves no time or patience for repetition and practice. Only in novels these representations are not the reader's own, but other people's thoughts and combinations quickly succeeding each other, and the readers themselves are wanting in that which, in genius, counterbalances repetition. The whole thing, besides, is subject to the corrective that we all have most memory for that which interests us, and least for that which does not. Great minds, therefore, are apt to forget in an incredibly short time the petty affairs and trifling occurrences of daily life, and the commonplace people with whom they come in contact, whereas they have a wonderful recollection of those things which have importance in themselves and for them. It is, however, on the whole, easy to understand that we should more readily remember such series of representations as are connected together by the thread of one or more of the above-mentioned species of reasons and consequences, than such as have no connection with one another, but only with our will according to the law of motives, that is to say, those which are arbitrarily grouped. For in the former, the fact that we know the formal part a priori saves us half the trouble, and this probably gave rise to Plato's doctrine that all learning is mere remembering. As far as possible, we ought to try and reduce all that we wish to incorporate in our memory to a perceptible image, either directly, or as an example, a mere simile, or an analogue, or indeed in any other way, because intuitive perceptions take a far firmer hold than any abstract thoughts, let alone mere words. This is why we remember things we have ourselves experienced so much better than those of which we read. Chapter 8. General Observations and Results. Section 46. The Systematic Order. The order of succession in which I have stated the various forms of the principle of sufficient reason in this treatise is not systematic. It has been chosen for the sake of greater clearness, in order first to present what is better known and least presupposes the rest. In this I have followed Aristotle's rule. Sometimes also with instruction a start must be made not from what is first and the beginning of the matter, but from what is most easily understood. But the systematic order in which the different classes of reasons ought to follow one another is the following. First of all should come the principle of sufficient reason of being, and in this again, first its application to time, as being the simple schema containing only what is essential in all the other forms of the principle of sufficient reason, nay, as being the prototype of all finitude. The reason of being in space having next been stated, the law of causality would then follow, after which would come the law of motives, and last of all the principle of sufficient reason of knowing. For the other classes of reasons refer to immediate representations, whereas this last class refers to representations derived from other representations. The truth expressed above that time is the simple schema which merely contains the essential part of all the forms of the principle of sufficient reason explains the absolutely perfect clearness and precision of arithmetic, a point in which no other science can compete with it, for all sciences, being throughout combinations of reasons and consequences, are based upon the principle of sufficient reason. Now, the series of numbers is the simple and only series of reasons and consequences of being in time. On account of this perfect simplicity, nothing being omitted, no indefinite relations left, this series leaves nothing to be desired as regards accuracy, apodictic certainty, and clearness. All the other sciences yield precedence in this respect to arithmetic, even geometry, because so many relations arise out of the 3 dimensions of space that a comprehensive synopsis of them becomes too difficult, not only for pure, but even for empirical intuition. Complicated geometrical problems are therefore only solved by calculation. That is, geometry is quick to resolve itself into arithmetic. It is not necessary to point out the existence of sundry elements of obscurity in the other sciences. Section 47. Relation in time between reason and consequence. According to the laws of causality and of motivation, a reason must precede its consequence in time. That this is absolutely essential, I have shown in my chief work, to which I here refer my readers in order to avoid repeating myself. Therefore, if we only bear in mind that it is not one thing which is the cause of another thing, but one state which is the cause of another state, we shall not allow ourselves to be misled by examples like that given by Kant, that the stove, which is the cause of the warmth of the room, is simultaneous with its effect. The state of the stove, that is, its being warmer than its surrounding medium, must precede the communication of its surplus caloric to that medium. Now, as each layer of air on becoming warm makes way for a cooler layer rushing in, the first state, the cause, and consequently also the second, the effect, are renewed until at last the temperature of stove and room become equalized. Here, therefore, we have no permanent cause, the stove, and permanent effect, the warmth of the room, as simultaneous things, but a chain of changes, that is, a constant renewing of 2 states, one of which is the effect of the other. From this example, however, it is obvious that even Kant's conception of causality was far from clear. On the other hand, the principle of sufficient reason of knowing conveys with it no relation in time, but merely a relation for our reason. Here, therefore, before and after have no meaning. In the principle of sufficient reason of being, so far as it is valid in geometry, there is likewise no relation in time, but only a relation in space, of which we might say that all things were coexistent, if here the words coexistence and succession had any meaning. In arithmetic, on the contrary, the reason of being is nothing else but precisely the relation of time itself. Section 48. Reciprocity of reasons. Hypothetical judgments may be founded upon the principle of sufficient reason in each of its significations, as indeed every hypothetical judgment is ultimately based upon that principle, and here the laws of hypothetical conclusions always hold good. That is to say, it is right to infer the existence of the consequence from the existence of the reason, and the non-existence of the reason from the non-existence of the consequence. But it is wrong to infer the non-existence of the consequence from the non-existence of the reason, and the existence of the reason from the existence of the consequence. Now, it is singular that in geometry we are nevertheless nearly always able to infer the existence of the reason from the existence of the consequence, and the non-existence of the consequence from the non-existence of the reason. This proceeds, as I have shown in section 37, from the fact that as each line determines the position of the rest, it is quite indifferent which we begin at, that is, which we consider as the reason and which as the consequence. We may easily convince ourselves of this by going through the whole of the geometrical theorems. It is only where we have to do not only with figures, i.e., with the positions of lines, but with planes independently of figures, that we find it, in most cases, impossible to infer the existence of the reason from the existence of the consequence, or, in other words, to convert the propositions by making the condition the conditioned. The following theorem gives an instance of this. Triangles, whose lengths and bases are equal, include equal areas. This cannot be converted as follows. Triangles whose areas are equal have likewise equal bases and lengths, for the lengths may stand in inverse proportion to the bases. In section 20, it has already been shown that the law of causality does not admit of reciprocity, since the effect never can be the cause of its cause. Therefore, the conception of reciprocity is, in its right sense, inadmissible. Reciprocity, according to the principle of sufficient reason of knowing, would only be possible between equivalent conceptions, since the spheres of these alone cover each other mutually. Apart from these, it only gives rise to a vicious circle. Section 49. Necessity. The principle of sufficient reason in all its forms is the sole principle and the sole support of all necessity. For necessity has no other true and distinct meaning than that of the infallibility of the consequence when the reason is posited. Accordingly, every necessity is conditioned. Absolute, i.e., unconditioned necessity, therefore is a contradictio in adjecto, contradiction between parts of an argument. For to be necessary can never mean anything but to result from a given reason. By defining it as what cannot not be, on the other hand, we give a mere verbal definition, and screen ourselves behind an extremely abstract conception to avoid giving a definition of the thing. But it is not difficult to drive us from this refuge by inquiring how the non-existence of anything can be possible or even conceivable, since all existence is only given empirically. It then comes out that it is only possible so far as some reason or other is posited or present, from which it follows. To be necessary and to follow from a given reason are thus convertible conceptions, and may always as such be substituted one for the other. The conception of an absolutely necessary being, which finds so much favour with pseudo-philosophers, contains therefore a contradiction. It annuls by the predicate absolute, i.e., unconditioned by anything else, the only determination which makes the necessary conceivable. Here again we have an instance of the improper use of abstract conceptions to play off a metaphysical artifice, such as those I have already pointed out in the conceptions immaterial substance, cause in general, absolute reason, etc., etc. I can never insist too much upon all abstract conceptions being checked by perception. There exists, accordingly, a fourfold necessity in conformity with the four forms of the principle of sufficient reason. 1. Logical necessity, according to the principle of sufficient reason of knowing, in virtue of which, when once we have admitted the premises, we must absolutely admit the conclusion. 2. Physical necessity, according to the law of causality, in virtue of which, as soon as the cause presents itself, the effect must infallibly follow. 3. Mathematical necessity, according to the principle of sufficient reason of being, in virtue of which every relation which is stated in a true geometrical theorem is as that theorem affirms it to be, and every correct calculation remains irrefutable. 4. Moral necessity, in virtue of which every human being, every animal even, is compelled, as soon as a motive presents itself, to do that which alone is in accordance with the inborn and immutable character of the individual. This action now follows its cause, therefore, as infallibly as every other effect, though it is less easy here to predict what that effect will be than in other cases, because of the difficulty we have in fathoming and completely knowing the individual empirical character and its allotted sphere of knowledge, which is indeed a very different thing from ascertaining the chemical properties of a neutral salt and predicting its reaction. I must repeat this again and again on account of the dunces and blockheads who, in defiance of the unanimous authority of so many great thinkers, still persist in audaciously maintaining the contrary, for the benefit of their old woman's philosophy. I am not a professor of philosophy, forsooth, that I need bow to the folly of others. Section 50. Series of Reasons and Consequences. According to the law of causality, the condition is itself always conditioned, and, moreover, conditioned in the same way. Therefore, there arises a series in infinitum, a parte ante, from the side of the before. It is just the same with the reason of being in space. Each relative space is a figure. It has its limits by which it is connected with another relative space, and which themselves condition the figure of this other, and so on throughout all dimensions in infinitum. But when we examine a single figure in itself, the series of reasons of being has an end, because we start from a given relation, just as the series of causes comes to an end if we stop at pleasure for any particular cause. In time, the series of reasons of being has infinite extension both a parte ante, from the side of the before, and a parte post, from the side of the after, since each moment is conditioned by a preceding one, and necessarily gives rise to the following. Time has therefore neither beginning nor end. On the other hand, the series of reasons of knowledge, that is, a series of judgments, each of which gives logical truth to the other, always ends somewhere, i.e., either in an empirical, a transcendental, or a metalogical truth. If the reason of the major to which we have been led is an empirical truth, and we still continue asking why, it is no longer a reason of knowledge that is asked for, but a cause. In other words, the series of reasons of knowing passes over into the series of reasons of becoming. But if we do the contrary, that is, if we allow the series of reasons of becoming to pass over into the series of reasons of knowing in order to bring it to an end, this is never brought about by the nature of the thing, but always by a special purpose. It is, therefore, a trick, and this is the sophism known by the name of the ontological proof. For when a cause at which it seems desirable to stop short in order to make it the first cause has been reached by means of the cosmological proof, we find out that the law of causality is not so easily brought to a standstill, and still persists in asking why. So it is simply set aside, and the principle of sufficient reason of knowing, which from a distance resembles it, is substituted in its stead, and thus a reason of knowledge is given in the place of the cause which had been asked for, a reason of knowledge derived from the conception itself which has to be demonstrated, the reality of which is therefore still problematical, and this reason, as after all it is one, now has to figure as a cause. Of course, the conception itself has been previously arranged for this purpose, and reality slightly covered with a few husks, just for decency's sake, has been placed within it, so as to give the delightful surprise of finding it there, as has been shown in section 7. On the other hand, If a chain of judgments ultimately rests upon a principle of transcendental or of metalogical truth, and we still continue to ask why, we receive no answer at all, because the question has no meaning, i.e., it does not know what kind of reason it is asking for. For the principle of sufficient reason is the principle of all explanation. To explain a thing means to reduce its given existence or connection to some form or other of the principle of sufficient reason, in accordance with which form that existence or connection necessarily is that which it is. The principle of sufficient reason itself, i.e., the connection expressed by it in any of its forms, cannot therefore be further explained, because there exists no principle by which to explain the source of all explanation, just as the eye is unable to see itself, though it sees everything else. There are, of course, series of motives, since the resolve to retain an end becomes the motive for the resolve to use a whole series of means. Still, this series invariably ends a parte priori in a representation belonging to one of our two first classes, in which lies the motive which originally had the power to set this individual will in motion. The fact that it was able to do this is a datum for knowing the empirical character here given, but it is impossible to answer the question why that particular motive acts upon that particular character, because the intelligible character lies outside time and never becomes an object. Therefore, the series of motives, as such, finds its termination in some such final motive, and, according to the nature of its last link, passes into the series of causes, or that of reasons of knowledge, that is to say, into the former, when that last link is a real object, into the latter, when it is a mere conception. Section 51. Each science has for its guiding thread one of the forms of the principle of sufficient reason in preference to the others. As the question why always demands a sufficient reason, and as it is the connection of its notions according to the principle of sufficient reason which distinguishes science from a mere aggregate of notions, we have called that why the parent of all science. See Section 4. In each science, moreover, we find one of the forms of that principle predominating over the others as its guiding thread. Thus, in pure mathematics, the reason of being is the chief guiding thread, although the exposition of the proofs proceeds according to the reason of knowing only. In applied mathematics, the law of causality appears together with it, but in physics, chemistry, geology, etc., that law entirely predominates. The principle of sufficient reason in knowing finds vigorous application throughout all the sciences, for in all of them the particular is known through the general. But in botany, zoology, mineralogy, and other classifying sciences, it is the chief guide and predominates absolutely. The law of motives, motivation, is the chief guide in history, politics, pragmatic psychology, etc., etc., when we consider all motives and maxims, whatever they may be, as data for explaining actions. But when we make those motives and maxims the object matter of investigation from the point of view of their value and origin, the law of motives becomes the guide to ethics. In my chief work will be found the highest classification of the sciences, according to this principle. Section 52. Two principal results. I have endeavoured in this treatise to show that the principle of sufficient reason is a common expression for four completely different relations, each of which is founded upon a particular law given a priori, the principle of sufficient reason being a synthetical a priori principle. Now, according to the principle of homogeneity, we are compelled to assume that these four laws, discovered according to the principle of specification, as they agree in being expressed by one and the same term, must necessarily spring from one and the same original quality of our whole cognitive faculty as their common root, which we should accordingly have to look upon as the innermost germ of all dependence, relativeness, instability, and limitation of the objects of our consciousness, itself limited to sensibility, understanding, reason, subject and object, or of that world which the divine Plato repeatedly degrades to the ever arising and perishing, but in fact never existing, the knowledge of which is merely a mere thinking of supposing by means of irrational or senseless perception, and which Christendom, with a correct instinct, calls temporal, after that form of our principle, time, which I have defined as its simplest schema and the prototype of all limitation. The general meaning of the principle of sufficient reason may, in the main, be brought back to this, that everything existing, no matter when or where, exists by reason of something else. Now, the principle of sufficient reason is nevertheless a priori in all its forms, that is, it has its root in our intellect, therefore it must not be applied to the totality of existent things, the universe, including that intellect in which it presents itself. For a world like this, which presents itself in virtue of a priori forms, is just on that account mere phenomenon. Consequently, that which holds good with reference to it as the result of these forms cannot be applied to the world itself, i.e. to the thing in itself, representing itself in that world. Therefore, we cannot say, the world and all things in it exist by reason of something else, and this proposition is precisely the cosmological proof. If by the present treatise I have succeeded in deducing the result just expressed, it seems to me that every speculative philosopher who founds a conclusion upon the principle of sufficient reason, or indeed talks of a reason at all, is bound to specify which kind of reason he means. One might suppose that wherever there was any question of a reason, this would be done as a matter of course, and that all confusion would thus be impossible. Only too often, however, do we still find either the terms reason and cause confounded in indiscriminate use, or do we hear basis and what is based, condition and what is conditioned, principia and principiata talked about in quite a general way, without any nearer determination, perhaps because there is a secret consciousness that these conceptions are being used in an unauthorized way. Thus even Kant speaks of the thing in itself as the reason of the phenomenon, and also of a ground of the possibility of all phenomena, of an intelligible cause of phenomena, of an unknown ground of the possibility of the sensuous series in general, of a transcendental object as the ground of all phenomena, and of the reason why our sensibility should have this rather than all other supreme conditions, and so on in several places. Now all this does not seem to me to tally with those weighty, profound, nay, immortal words of his, "The contingency of things is itself mere phenomenon, and can lead to no other than the empirical regressus which determines phenomena." That since Kant, the conceptions reason and consequence, principium and principiatum, etc., etc., have been and still are used in a yet more indefinite and even quite transcendent sense, everyone must know who is acquainted with the more recent works on philosophy. The following is my objection against this promiscuous employment of the word ground, reason, and with it of the principle of sufficient reason in general. It is likewise the second result, intimately connected with the first, which the present treatise gives concerning its subject matter proper. The four laws of our cognitive faculty, of which the principle of sufficient reason is the common expression, by their common character as well as by the fact that all objects for the subject are divided amongst them, proclaim themselves to be posited by one and the same primary quality and inner peculiarity of our knowing faculty, which faculty manifests itself as sensibility, understanding, and reason. Therefore, even if we imagined it to be possible for a new fifth class of objects to come about, we should in that case likewise have to assume that the principle of sufficient reason would appear in this class also under a different form. Notwithstanding all this, we still have no right to talk of an absolute reason, ground, nor does a reason in general, any more than a triangle in general, exist otherwise than as a conception derived by means of discursive reflection, nor is this conception, as a representation drawn from other representations, anything more than a means of thinking several things in one. Now, just as every triangle must be either acute-angled, right-angled, or obtuse-angled, and either equilateral, isosceles, or scalene, so also must every reason belong to one or other of the four possible kinds of reasons I have pointed out. Moreover, since we have only four well-distinguished classes of objects, every reason must also belong to one or other of these four, and no further class being possible, reason itself is forced to rank it within them, for as soon as we employ a reason, we presuppose the four classes as well as the faculty of representing, i.e., the whole world, and must hold ourselves within these bounds, never transcending them. Should others, however, see this in a different light, and opine that a reason in general is anything but a conception, derived from the four kinds of reasons, which expresses what they all have in common, we might revive the controversy of the realists and nominalists, and then I should side with the latter. Leighton Pugh was reading On the Fourfold Root of the Principle of Sufficient Reason by Arthur Schopenhauer for Ukemi Audiobooks. For full details of Ukemi releases, go to ukemiaudiobooks.com.
Audible hopes you've enjoyed this program.